my god, it's her dream come true, diving into a big pile of girls.
Get in, loser! We're doing a deep dive. Hi guys, welcome to a video, and in today's video we're just going to be doing a deep dive into the lesbianism in Mean Girls. Oh yes, Tina Fey's lesbian Frankenstein monster. And discussing the very popular theory that the character of Regina George is in fact a lesbian. I mean, right? She was a lesbian. With the recent release of the 2024 Mean Girls movie musical, I also thought it would be interesting to look at how the portrayal of lesbianism has changed in Mean Girls since the original 2004 film, aka Tina Fey's redemption arc. Now, when it comes to Mean Girls, it might not seem like lesbianism plays that big a part in the original 2004 film because none of the characters in it are canonically lesbian. But if you think about it, the entire plot of Mean Girls is driven by this unhealed rift between Janice Ian and Regina George, and that rift between them is centered around lesbianism. Furthermore, when you really break down the characterization of Janice Ian and even the characterization of Regina George, there are elements of it which are purposefully lesbian coded. As a result, lesbianism is actually a core element in Mean Girls, even if it's not necessarily overt. And when we start to deconstruct the lesbianism in the film, say lesbianism again, that element is actually incredibly layered and interesting. And kind of messy. I'm just gonna say it here because I feel like it needs to be said, and I haven't seen anybody else discuss this in relation to Mean Girls, but I think Tina Fey's unique relationship with lesbianism offers a lot of context for the weird writing around lesbianism and Janice Ian in Mean Girls. Tina Fey has a long history of people assuming that she's a lesbian when she's not, and she often explores that aspect of her life through her work. I mean, there's an entire episode about it in 30 Rock. So when we take that into consideration, it explains the character of Janice Ian being so lesbian coded and yet ending up with Kevin G. Of course, a purposefully lesbian coded character ending up with a man has problematic implications even if they're unintentional, and doesn't read very well, even for the early 2000s. I remember people thought the writing around Janice was weird even back then, but there is at least an explanation for it, in that Janice is supposed to be a reflection of Tina Fey herself, a straight woman who people often assume is a lesbian because she ticks a lot of lesbian stereotype boxes. Of course, that doesn't exactly translate through the character of Janice very well, which is why her ending up with Kevin G is so confusing, but it's also not Tina Fey trying to force heteronormativity on an obviously lesbian character either. Well, I mean, it is, but she doesn't have bad intentions. Now, when it comes to the 2024 movie musical, the lesbian element has of course been completely reshaped to resonate with a modern audience. The character of Janice has also been made canonically lesbian, and the plot is still driven by the unhealed rift she has with Regina, which is still tied into her sexuality. So lesbianism is also a prominent theme in the 2024 production, but it's written in a much more progressive and healthy way, for the most part. That makes deconstructing the lesbianism in the movie musical a lot more straightforward. It's still a little bit messy, a little bit confusing, but it's nowhere near as convoluted or complicated as it is in the original film. But before we dive in, I just wanted to share some fun facts about Mean Girls, because I'm not like a regular mum. I'm a cool mum. So firstly, I'm sure most of you are already aware of this, but the original Mean Girls film was based on the non-fiction book Queen Bees and Wannabes, which is a 2002 book for parents by Rosalind Wiseman. The book focuses on the ways in which girls in high schools form cliques and on patterns of aggressive teenage girl behaviour and how to deal with them. So Tina Fey had to construct an entire fictional narrative based on the elements from this book from scratch. And a very interesting fact related to this is in the book, the most popular girl in a school is given the title Queen Bee. And in Mean Girls, the character who fits that description is named Regina George. And Regina actually means queen in Latin, Italian, and Romanian. Gruel. The character of Janice Ian was named as a homage to the real-life musician Janice Ian, and her song At 17 can be heard playing in the background when the girls are fighting at Regina's house. The real Janice Ian is also openly lesbian, and more on that later. Speaking of lesbians, another fun fact is there's a scene in the 2004 film where Katie gets excited at the dance because she actually recognises a song called Built This Way, and that song was performed and co-written by songwriter and DJ Samantha Ronson. About 4 years after the release of this movie, and after several years of press speculation, Lindsay Lohan and Samantha Ronson acknowledged they were in a romantic relationship. And oh, you know that scene in the original film where Regina releases the burn book into the wild and all hell breaks loose? That's the best way to describe that relationship. And that's all I'm saying. A lot of the characters in Mean Girls are named after people Tina Fey personally knew. The character of Katie was named after Tina Fey's college roommate, Miss Norbury was named after her old German teacher, and Glen Coco is named after her older brother's good friend. Yes, Glen Coco is a real name. The character of Katie also has the same spelling as the maiden name of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, a 19th century pioneer in the American women's rights movement, and this ties into the film's theme of female empowerment. Tina Fey has actually said that she herself was the main inspiration behind the character of Regina George, and she also said that the character she identifies most with in Mean Girls is Janice Ian. If the lesbian sandal fits. What did I say earlier? There is a connection. There is a connection there. I told you. And lastly, in 2018, a musical stage adaptation of Mean Girls opened on Broadway, which was then adapted into a movie musical in 2024. Tina Fey securing the bag. We love to see it. Now, as a disclaimer for this video, obviously the original Mean Girls film came out in 2004, and for context, the early 2000s were an interesting time for on-screen lesbian representation. There was certainly an uptick in lesbian media in this period due to all of the activism and media attention surrounding lesbianism in the 90s. I did a whole video on that if you're interested in how the 90s shaped lesbian representation on screen. It is my baby and you should go and give it a kiss on the forehead. But it's important to know, especially for the context of deconstructing the 2004 film, that the early 2000s were a period where homophobia was still very normalised and lesbianism was still very much othered. Even though it was also a period where societal attitudes towards homosexuality were actively shifting towards a more positive place. People were just not exposed to it in the way that they are today, and so therefore it was not, it's something that was normalised at all, and it was still very much an insult to call somebody a lesbian, which is why I was closeted in school. Yeah. But I say all this to say a film released in 2004 is very much going to be a product of its time and have a very different approach to lesbianism than a film released in 2024. And of course that needs to be taken into consideration when looking at these two productions of Mean Girls individually. Now let's get into it. She knows a little bit too much about the L word. So let's start by looking at the aspects of Regina George's character in the 2004 Mean Girls production that support the theory that she's probably a lesbian. Now, in Mean Girls, Regina George dates both Aaron Samuels and Shane Oman. However, throughout the film, it's notable that her interest in men appears to be largely performative and driven by her insecurities, rather than rooted in genuine connection. Regina's relationship with Aaron Samuels is motivated by her need to compete with Katie. We know that Regina doesn't really love Aaron because we learn that in the past, she actually broke up with him to be with Shane Oman, the very same guy that she cheats on him with. Furthermore, Regina only gets back with Aaron and displays any affection towards him at all as a power play over Katie. I mean, only showing affection to a boy when another girl is looking just to get under her skin. It's giving Fruit Loop. And when Aaron finally breaks up with Regina, her upset seems more connected to her ego and losing her power over him, as opposed to over losing somebody that she loves. If we compare this to Katie and Aaron's relationship, it's night and day. You can see a clear interest and connection between the two of them that seems rooted in genuine attraction. And all of that romantic interest and connection we see between Aaron and Katie is totally absent from any of Regina's relationships with men in the film. If we then move our focus on to Regina's relationship with Shane Oman, it becomes slightly more complicated because obviously there is an emphasis on the physical rather than the emotional aspect of their relationship for the sake of the plot. But again, throughout most of the film, it's as though Shane too is just there for Regina to use when she feels like it. And apart from the brief kiss they share at the spring fling, Shane is treated like an accessory that Regina uses physically behind Aaron's back, and there's no indication that she truly cares for either of them at any point during the film, especially considering that she's the driving force behind the cheating, the manipulation, and the breakups. But in any case, from what we do see in the film, the point is she uses men like they're props and doesn't seem to actually care about them. However, and this is where deconstructing Regina's character becomes complicated, we don't really see any affection or genuine emotion aside from anger from her in any of her relationships with other people. And in some ways she's presented as a two-dimensional Disney villain and a surface level antagonist. She's mean for the sake of being mean, which of course relates to the whole plastic concept for her character. She's not real and she's not human. That's the point. There's also the fact that she's clearly an exaggeration of the vapid teenage girl stereotype to take into consideration when deconstructing her character. So you could easily interpret her lack of genuine connection to men as being because she only cares about herself. But within the context of looking at Mean Girls and deconstructing her character through a lesbian lens, her lack of emotion or genuine connection with men can also be interpreted as a result of her lack of attraction to them. The other interesting note about Regina's character in relation to men is she doesn't pander to them, and there's never a moment in the film where she's seen stroking a male ego or putting men's feelings before her own. In fact, we see in the scene where Jason tries to humiliate Katie, make a sexual joke at her expense, Regina speaks up and calls him out on it, instead of laughing along with everyone else. In fact, she ends up humiliating Jason, and she also doesn't tolerate the way he treats Gretchen either, which is interesting because she's hardly a woman's woman and seeks to put women down herself. But strangely, she doesn't tolerate men doing the same. If we compare Regina's behaviour with men to the way that Katie, Gretchen, and even Karen behave, where they all either run after men or are motivated by male attention, it's a stark contrast. So Regina having a very low tolerance for men, her inability to genuinely emotionally connect with them or see them through rose-tinted glasses, like a lot of the other female characters in this film do, are collectively traits which are suggestive of lesbianism. You're less likely to care for men or their feelings when they hold no interest or romantic value to you, and Regina embodying those traits does provide an argument for the lesbian theory. The next and probably the most prominent aspect of Regina George's character in relation to the theory that she's a lesbian is her whole dynamic with Janice Ian. As I've said earlier, their relationship and unresolved feelings about one another is what drives the overarching plot of Mean Girls. The film's narrative is literally centered around their broken relationship. But in order to understand their dynamic properly, we first need to look at the character of Janice Ian. As discussed earlier, Janice Ian is named after a lesbian singer-songwriter. Her character clearly ticks a lot of lesbian stereotype boxes. She's an art student. She has a strong dislike of anything normative, anything superficial. She doesn't seem to take an interest in boys. Her best friend is gay, and she herself is gender non-conforming. Whilst none of those things individually make her or anyone else a lesbian, collectively they are suggestive of it, and it's fair to say her character is purposefully lesbian coded. And this is what makes Janice's attitude towards lesbianism in Mean Girls so confusing, because her characterization very much suggests that she wouldn't really have an issue with lesbianism, yet she treats the word lesbian as though it's a slur that should never be uttered. And instead of simply telling Katie that she's straight but Regina spread a false rumour about her, she can't even bear to broach the subject at all. And whereas Regina, viewing lesbianism as something negative, aligns with her characterization, the same can't be said for Janice. And so her discomfort with the word lesbian or being seen as one is exaggerated in a way which suggests that there's more to the story and her relationship with Regina. It's possible that Janice's negative views on lesbianism are also an indication of her own internalized homophobia. And given her characterization, that would also be a more plausible explanation for her behaviour around the word lesbian, as well as explain why Regina left her with such a deep wound. And that brings us right back around to the deconstruction of Regina and Janice's relationship. So, we see near the beginning of the film that Janice has very strong feelings about Regina. She's very keen on the idea of getting Katie to spy on Regina, and she continuously, passionately rants about Regina too. So much so that Katie even points out, "You seem to really hate her." Janice doesn't casually dislike Regina or find her annoying. She has a passionate hatred for her, and these strong feelings are suggestive of a deep hurt between them, which adds a further layer to their relationship. Obviously, there's a fine line between love and hate, and the passionate antagonism between Janice and Regina is reminiscent of the "I really hate that person but secretly have a crush on them," a big lesbian crush on them trope. And Regina clearly antagonises Janice all throughout the film. We see that in the burn book, Janice has been labelled a dyke, and then when Regina sees Katie talking to Janice, she approaches her to ask why, before casually dropping some Regina and Janice lore on Katie, where we discover that Regina used to be best friends with Janice in middle school. However, when Regina got a boyfriend, she claims that Janice got jealous and started being obsessive. Regina says, "Let me tell you something about Janice Ian. We were best friends in middle school. I know, right? It's so embarrassing. I don't even... whatever." So then in 8th grade, I started going out with my first boyfriend, Kyle, who was totally gorgeous, but then he moved to Indiana. And Janice was like, weirdly jealous of him. Like, if I would blow her off to hang out with Kyle, she'd be like, "Why didn't you call me back?" And I'd be like, why are you so obsessed with me?" So then for my birthday party, which was an all-girls pool party, I was like, "Janice, I can't invite you because I think you're a lesbian." I mean, I couldn't have a lesbian at my party. There were going to be girls there in their bathing suits. I mean, right? She was a lesbian. So then her mum called my mum and started yelling at her. And it was so retarded, and then she dropped out of school because no one would talk to her, and she came back in the fall for high school and her hair was all cut off and she was totally weird. And now I guess she's on crack. So there's a lot to unpack here. First of all, it's interesting that before Regina became plastic, she was best friends with Janice. And given that Janice is so othered, it suggests that Regina may have been drawn to that or bonded with Janice over their shared otherness. And of course, otherness has lesbian connotations. To be lesbian is to be other. So their friendship does have a suggestive interpretation. Things fall apart between them when Regina gets a boyfriend, and Regina tries to spin it to Katie as Janice having a crush on her. Now, some people speculate that because Janice is Lebanese, Regina misheard that as lesbian, and that's why she thought Janice was into her. But I don't think that's the case, because Regina clearly states why she thought Janice was a lesbian, and the Lebanese line is just Tina Fey being funny and making a joke in relation to the lesbian rumours connected to Janice's character. But anyway, it appears that Regina immediately jumps to Janice being a lesbian who is obsessed with her, rather than understanding that Janice was likely just frustrated that she had been abandoned by her friend. And there are multiple ways to interpret or deconstruct what Regina is saying here. One interpretation is there being some truth to what Regina is saying, in that she truly thought that Janice did have feelings for her, and she may have returned those feelings, panicked and lashed out due to internalized homophobia, or she may have simply been just projecting her own lesbianism onto Janice. Or of course you could read it as Regina suddenly switching up on Janice just because she's a spiteful and self-absorbed person who ends up lashing out at everyone because it makes her feel superior. But in any case, the facts are that at one point Janice and Regina were drawn to each other as friends. Things became uneasy between them when Regina got a boyfriend. Janice got incredibly hurt, and the both of them have very overtly negative attitudes towards lesbianism, particularly Regina, who places an emphasis on the fact that lesbianism has negative connotations. And as a result, they are both resentful of each other and continuously seek to antagonize each other throughout the film. And this creates a multitude of complex layers between them, tied into homophobia or potentially internalized homophobia, and it's very easy to interpret this chain of events as the both of them acting out and projecting because they're too scared to talk about their true feelings in any capacity. Funnily enough, Janice and Regina are the two characters in Mean Girls who needed to sit down and have a conversation the most, and they never did. I know the core messaging of Mean Girls is about the awful way girls can treat each other from a wider perspective, and it's not a film about internalized homophobia. I certainly don't think Tina Fey really intended for Regina and Janice's relationship to ever be that deep, but intentional or not, Tina Fey built these complex layers between the two of them surrounding lesbianism, which creates a lot of room for various interpretations of their relationship. Regina's homophobia and repeated accusation towards Janice of being a lesbian is also an interesting discussion point. You have the Dyke label in the burn book, you have Regina's conversation with Katie about her history with Janice, and then you have Regina's remark about Janice diving into a big pile of girls. So Regina seems to enjoy actively taunting Janice for allegedly being a lesbian, and it's almost a fixation for her. This is especially apparent when we take into consideration how often Regina brings lesbianism up compared to any of the other characters in Mean Girls. Whilst the other characters may have been complicit in homophobia by laughing along or not calling it out, again, homophobia was very normalized within the early 2000s, they don't seem particularly interested in antagonizing anyone over it in the way that Regina does to Janice. Now, I'm sure to most people, Regina's homophobia is simply an extension of being a mean girl, but there's a persistent stereotype about quote-unquote straight people who are overtly homophobic or have an obsession with picking on gay people being the ones who are usually closeted and struggling with internalized homophobia themselves. And this has a truth to it because it explains the personal interest and fixation with homosexuality. And it's also a reflection of their negative perceptions, which they then apply to themselves, and explains why they stay closeted and why they're not comfortable with accepting their own sexuality. So again, looking at Mean Girls through a lesbian lens, Regina's fixation on Janice being a lesbian and repeatedly bringing that up when literally nobody asked, does read as projection, and almost as though she herself is protesting too much due to internalized homophobia. The last aspect of Regina's character that is relevant to the lesbian theory is one that admittedly relies on reductive stereotypes, and it's the fact that she joins the lacrosse team so that she has an outlet for her anger and not only finds her peace of mind there, but also fits right in with all the other women on the team. Obviously, playing a certain sport does not equate to lesbianism as a rule, but at the same time, the sports lesbian stereotype exists for a reason. A lot of lesbian or bisexual women are drawn to certain sports and female sports teams. Lacrosse, rugby and golf in particular do have a healthy number of out lesbian or bisexual players. And so Regina ending up on a lacrosse team and finding her peace and happiness there, when lacrosse does have associations with lesbianism, does add further suggestion to her character, and taking all of the other aspects of her character into consideration, kind of feels like the cherry on top of the lesbian cake. Oh my god, it's her dream come true, a big pile of girls diving on top of her. Outside of the characters of Janice and Regina, the only other lesbian element to Mean Girls is the scene where two women are performatively kissing at the Halloween party. Very obviously for male benefit, which on the one hand, it's not that deep, it's just a reflection of party culture and how lesbianism was and is utilised as a spectacle or for male attention. But on the other hand, it's interesting that the only portrayals of lesbianism in Mean Girls either frame lesbianism as something which has negative connotations or as something performed for male benefit. And even if the film doesn't endorse homophobia, and Katie did look mildly disturbed at the obvious performative lesbianism happening at the Halloween party, when you really think about the messaging Mean Girls sends out about lesbianism to all the young girls who consume this film, especially in the early 2000s, it is pretty horrifying. Overall, in analysing the character of Regina George in the 2004 Mean Girls production, we can see that there is sufficient suggestion in her characterization to support the theory that she is indeed a closeted lesbian. I think within the context of the time in which this film was made, a lot of Regina's behaviour can be interpreted as her having internalized homophobia and projecting her own feelings onto Janice. Ironically, I think this stemmed from Tina Fey having little to no understanding of how internalized homophobia can present itself, and therefore inadvertently making Regina George lesbian coded. I mean, this film is potentially proof that Tina Fey is in fact a heterosexual. In the weirdest way possible, she's finally beaten the lesbian allegations. Okay. Now, whilst the way lesbianism is treated in Mean Girls is questionable, the film isn't intentionally homophobic, and if anything, it actually highlights the fact that assuming lesbians are going to be in love with you just because you're a woman or viewing them as predatory is a self-absorbed and delusional way of thinking. But at the same time, it does also treat the word lesbian as a slur, and there's weird implications, although as I explained earlier, completely unintentional on Tina Fey's part, behind the fact that Janice was so heavily lesbian coded. I mean, she was named after a literal lesbian, yet ends up dating Kevin G. It felt less like, hey, straight gender non-conforming women exist, and more like, hey, everything was right and wholesome in the end because Janice is quote-unquote normal after all, and not a horrible lesbian as she was accused of being. It was giving reinforced heteronormativity. Ew. And it's also odd that Damien's homosexuality isn't an issue throughout the film, and being a gay man doesn't have negative connotations for the most part, whereas lesbianism does, so there's very mixed messaging there too. But ultimately, as I've said many times throughout this video, the film is just a product of its time, and Tina Fey was clearly working through some feelings. So, 4 candy canes for Regina George being inadvertently lesbian coded and Janice Ian being intentionally lesbian coded and both clearly being in love with each other, and none for Tina Fey. Bye!
You know how she rolls, but you're still not sure.
Moving on to the 2024 Mean Girls movie musical, and the approach to lesbianism has been completely revamped. This production in general is very sanitized in comparison to the 2004 film. However, the social climate has changed drastically in the past 20 years, and it makes sense to change certain things in order for the narrative to resonate with a modern audience. In terms of the movie musical's approach to lesbianism, Tina Fey has actually spoken about how and why the approach has changed and become much more progressive in an interview with the New York Times. She said, "There's a joke in the original movie where Janice gets up on the table and Regina says, 'Oh my god, it's her dream come true,' diving into a huge pile of girls. It was mine and Sam Jane's feeling that Regina wouldn't try that now because she knows the kids around her would be like, 'That's homophobic.' She would know not to be homophobic and hopefully truly would not be homophobic." And Tina Fey is right. Calling someone a lesbian in 2024 doesn't quite have the same impact as it once had in 2004. Less people would tolerate or laugh at blatantly open homophobia, so therefore it makes much more sense that the word lesbian is no longer treated as an insult in the 2024 production. The character of Janice is now openly lesbian. Her last name has been changed to Imike. She no longer treats the word lesbian like it's a slur, and she ends up going to the spring fling with another girl. So there's no longer any weird, reinforced heteronormativity with her character, and in general, a lot of the negative lesbian representation or connotations around lesbianism in the 2004 film has been repaired in the movie musical, which again makes sense within the context of adapting the original narrative into a modern day setting. As for Regina George, she is now played by Renee Rapp, and Rapp is an openly bisexual actor who, interestingly enough, has actually spoken about how she purposely brought lesbian energy into the role of Regina George, even though the character is not a canon lesbian. Rapp said, "Regina being a lesbian was always my interpretation of it. Still is my interpretation of it. It might not be other people's and I truly don't care. It's mine and that's how I feel." So Renee Rapp's approach to the role obviously shapes Regina's characterization in the movie musical to an extent, and the suggestion of Regina's attraction to women certainly translates in the film. Rapp executes this flirtatious suggestion of Regina liking women by bringing more emotional subtleties to the way that she connects with other people, and she conveys a lot in this film through eye contact and body language, which fleshes out the character of Regina and her dynamic with other people in a way that's very different from the original film. As previously mentioned, the other element of Regina's character, which is different from the 2004 version, is her relationship to homophobia. The 2024 Regina is much less overtly homophobic. However, the way she antagonizes Janice and uses Janice's sexuality against her still has homophobic implications. It's revealed that Regina and Janice were best friends in middle school, that they had matching plush toys, and when Janice came out to Regina, they both put gay pride pins on their toys in solidarity. Now, this action by Regina suggests that she's actually supportive of lesbians and that she has a much more healthy relationship with lesbianism that diminishes any potential projection or unresolved feelings pertaining to her own sexuality. However, it's then revealed that Regina and Janice actually kissed during a game of Spin the Bottle because Regina wanted to get attention from a guy named Kyle. Right after the kiss, Regina then mocks Janice by saying, "I knew she would let me, she's like obsessed with me." Regina then starts describing Janice as an obsessed lesbian to everyone and uses the Solidarity Gay plushie toy to mock Janice even further, which of course eventually leads to Janice Janice snapping and Regina painting her as crazy, even though she'd been deliberately taunting her all along. So this backstory between Janice and Regina is a lot more complicated than the backstory for them in the original film. Janice essentially had her feelings played with, her sexuality used against her, and she was betrayed by someone she thought was a friend. And I think this backstory makes their relationship a lot more complicated because since Janice is openly lesbian, there's a plausible possibility that she had romantic feelings for Regina when the kiss took place, which would explain why Regina's betrayal cut so deep, why it drove Janice over the edge, and Janice's passionate need for revenge. Regina's attitude towards Janice is also much more complicated in the movie musical than it is in the original film because of her contradictory behaviour. We learn that Regina was once supportive of Janice being a lesbian, and she doesn't appear to be overtly homophobic. And yet, kissing Janice and accusing her of obsession afterwards, to the extent that she did, very much has homophobic implications. As I said, it's using Janice's sexuality against her. And there's really only two interpretations of Regina's behaviour. It's either tied up into her sudden descent into cruelty, into being a mean girl, which is so much more evil than anything the original Regina did, or Regina has internalized homophobia and she's projecting that onto Janice. But unlike in the original film, the latter doesn't really make sense. When Regina was previously supportive and had a healthy attitude towards lesbianism, especially when that fact is combined with the general sapphic energy that rap applies to Regina as well. So I think the convoluted lesbian aspects of the movie musical just ultimately come down to messy writing, which seems related to Tina Fey, not wanting to divert too much from the original plot, yet at the same time lessen the homophobic aspects and make Janice a canon lesbian to amend for her previous crimes. So therefore, Janice's rift with Regina is still anchored to lesbianism, but in a way that isn't directly about Janice's lesbianism, which is a fine line to tread. And it explains why the writing around Janice and Regina's relationship, and Regina's characterization in particular, is confusing, leaves room for interpretation, and yet again, leaves us with so many questions. Oh, Tina Fey, you beautiful, magical weaver of repressed lesbianism in stories. Okay. Overall, despite Janice being openly lesbian and Regina being purposefully sapphic-coded, there's actually not much to deconstruct in terms of lesbianism in the movie musical in comparison to the original 2004 film. This is largely because Janice is openly lesbian and she's portrayed in a fairly healthy way. There's not much to critique or deconstruct in terms of her characterization. Regina is also purposefully sapphic-coded and no longer openly homophobic, and this suggests that she leans more towards bisexual than a closeted lesbian, which also uncomplicates her character, although it does make her actions towards Janice seem a lot more cruel. The only complex discussion point is the true nature of the relationship between Regina and Janice, and it remains open for interpretation because these two characters never sit down and communicate their feelings in a healthy way in any version of this damn story, despite the story being centered around their unhealed rift. Tina Fey is just gatekeeping the true nature of their relationship at this point. I also don't think the more progressive aspects of the movie musical make it a better film in comparison to the original. I think each production has its own unique pros and cons, but if nothing else, art is a reflection of life, and it's very encouraging to see how much progress we've made with on-screen lesbian representation through these two productions of Mean Girls, through Tina Fey unpacking her feelings towards lesbianism. Okay guys, thanks for watching this deep dive into the lesbianism in Mean Girls. Let me know your thoughts on this topic down in the comments section below. If you've made it this far, you should leave the painting nails emoji, I don't know what this is, down in the comments section below too. So I can see who's truly committed, like a Mormon husband. Coolness. Bye. Does my hair look sexy pushed back? Don't answer that.